In this video, we're going to look at analyzing a graphic. More specifically, we're going to look at how to make sure your supporting sentences actually support the trends that you've identified. So here we have a grouped bar chart that gives us the average monthly expenditure on 5 different kinds of expenses for 3 different years. So we can see here that we have 5 groups or categories: utility bills, transport, rent, entertainment, and groceries. And in each category or group, we have 3 subgroups: 1990, 2000, and 2010. Now, if we look at this chart, we can see that there are 2 very clear, easily identifiable trends. The first one is that rent was the highest expense throughout the period. As we can see that the rent was the highest blue bar, we can see that rent was also the highest green bar, and rent was the highest yellow bar. So in all 3 years, rent was the highest. The second trend is that overall expenditure increased significantly throughout the period. Now, if we look at the groups and we compare the subgroups inside the same group, we can see that in most cases, the blue bar, 1990, was the lowest, the green is higher, but the yellow is the highest, which shows that the amount people were spending went up every time. So let's look at each of these trends separately now and how to support them. So we'll start with the first one: rent was the highest expense. We need to start with a clear topic sentence that clearly states the trend we've identified. And we can do that by simply saying rent was the highest expense throughout the period. Next, we need to support that with details. We need to give examples that prove our trend. And we can start by talking about how much money people spent on rent. So we start by saying that people spent £450 a month on rent in 1990, £525 a month in 2000, and £600 a month in 2010. So now we've given some detailed information about how much money people spent on rent, but that's not enough. We said in our trend that rent was the highest expense. So we need to prove that by comparing rent with the other expenses. So the best expense to compare it to is groceries, which was the second highest. So we can say that by comparison, the amount of money people spent on groceries was much lower, only spending £300 in 1990 and £350 in 2010. So here we're actually comparing rent and groceries and saying quite clearly the amount of money people spent on groceries was much lower. And we can do a similar thing with the other categories, but we can summarize the data a bit more. So we say that the highest amount people spent on utility bills was £150, the highest they spent on transport was £250, and that the amount of money they spent on entertainment was only ever around £100. Now we can see here that the amount of money people spent on entertainment actually went down a little bit over the period. But we don't need to mention that because it has nothing to do with our trend. Our trend is that rent is the highest, and we've mentioned that the amount of money people spent on entertainment was much lower than the amount of money people spent on rent. That's all we need to say. And then we can conclude with a simple concluding sentence that restates our trend using different words. And if you notice, what we've done here is we've acknowledged the other trend. We've said that the amount of money people spent increased between 1990 and 2000. But the main idea is that the money that people spent on rent was more than they spent on anything else. So now let's look at the second trend, which is that overall expenditure increased. Again, we need to start with a topic sentence that clearly states our trend. And we do that by saying overall household expenses increased considerably between 1990 and 2010. So now we need to write supporting sentences that support that trend, that show that the amount of money people spent in 1990 was less than the amount they spent in 2000 and less than the amount they spent in 2010. So we can start again with rent because rent is the highest expense. So we're going to give the same information, but we're going to present it slightly differently so that it supports our second trend. So we say here the amount spent on rent, for example, increased from $450 a month in 1990 to $600 a month in 2010. And then we can do a similar thing for the other expenses in the chart. So we say likewise, the amount spent on groceries increased from $325 to around $350. Now the important thing to notice here, because we're presenting the same information, but we're presenting it differently. In the first paragraph, when our trend was rent was the highest expense, we were saying that rent and groceries were different because rent was high and groceries were much lower. In this second paragraph, when we're saying that expenses increased, we're saying that rent and groceries are the same because the amount people spent on rent went up and the amount people spent on groceries went up. So we're presenting the same information, but the way we are presenting it, the words that we're using to link the information together, change the point that we're trying to make. Now, we already mentioned that entertainment, the amount of money people spent on entertainment actually went down during the period. Now here, we should talk about that because it's actually an exception to this second trend. So here we would say that entertainment was the only thing where the expenditure went down during the period. And again, we just finish with a simple concluding sentence that restates our main idea using different words. So remember, whenever you are describing a trend, you don't have to mention everything. You just need to talk about the best examples that prove your trend. And you need to make sure that you present that information in a way that clearly shows that it supports your trend. So we made the comparison very clear. We said that groceries were lower than rent. In the second paragraph, we said that rent went up and groceries went up. See you next time.